Hello, everyone. So excited to welcome you all to this edition of Cones. We're going to wait about another 30 seconds as folks continue to filter in. We had a lot of interest in this webinar today, so we want to make sure as many people as possible get a chance to attend. Thank you all so much for being here. We're really excited to welcome our speakers for today. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to Cones, our monthly California Naturalist online event series. I'm Sarah Mae Nelson, the Climate Stewards Academic Coordinator. Lovely to see a great mix of California naturalists and climate stewards here today. This series is created for the naturalists and stewards of the California Naturalist Program to connect across the state on topics including natural history, ecology, climate change, and the intersection of pressing human and environmental issues. We're expecting a full house today, and I have a few bits of housekeeping to go over before we begin. This is a Zoom meeting and not a webinar, so please remember to mute your mic and turn off your video just during the presentation portion so we don't have to worry about any background noise or distractions. If you're experiencing technical difficulties, please go ahead and try typing into the chat, and our CalNat staff will try to troubleshoot for you. We'll have time for questions and further discussion at the end, but because we have so many folks on the line, we primarily use the chat function for questions. So if you can type the word question before you type your question, that'll help alert our staff to what questions need to be directed toward our speakers for today. And we are recording this presentation, and it will be posted online to our YouTube channel probably in the next couple of days. I'd like to start off by acknowledging that this virtual presentation is taking place throughout the unceded territory of California, home to nearly 200 tribal nations. In particular, I'm speaking to you from Costanoan Rumsen Ohlone land on what is contemporarily known as the Monterey Peninsula. We want to acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of our various regions, and we encourage you to learn which tribal nations are indigenous to the area where you are living now. One excellent source of information is Native Land, and Elliot has dropped the link into the chat for you to explore later. If you do know your indigenous lands, original inhabitants, and you want to pop that into the chat, we'd always love to see that. So we are here today to talk about the open ocean and the ocean surface. And I am so excited because my original love is marine science and all things ocean. And we have Rebecca Helm here with us today. Dr. Helm is a marine biologist studying life in the open ocean and on the ocean surface. Helm grew up in Arizona and completed her undergraduate degree in marine science at Eckerd College before conducting research on jellyfish life cycles as a Fulbright Fellow in South Africa. She received a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from Brown University, where she was a National Science Foundation Graduate Student Research Fellow and an NSF EPSCoR Fellow. Her PhD work focused on the evolution of open ocean and coastal jellyfish species. She then conducted research on circadian rhythms as a postdoc at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, and later at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History as an NSF postdoctoral fellow, where she continued her research on coastal and open ocean jellies. For the last 4 years, she has been an assistant professor at the University of North Carolina, Asheville, where she has led multiple interdisciplinary projects on the biology of life on the high seas. She is now an assistant professor at Georgetown University. We also have joining us today Ari Puentes. Ari is an undergraduate biology student at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. He is interested in mycology and is working on a research project assessing the effects of prescribed fires on fungal communities. In addition to this project, he recently co-created the UNC Asheville Fungarium, the first fungarium in Western North Carolina. He is an avid naturalist and community science enthusiast and has been the community outreach manager for the Go See project since it started. Thank you both so much for joining us today, and I'm going to hand it over to you, Rebecca.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me and for that wonderful introduction. And it's really exciting to see all of you here today. I think, my heart of hearts, I'm a real naturalist. And so I love being able to share some of the things that I think a lot about that I think are just so magical and special in the context of naturalism, really connecting across lots of different lines of inquiry and thought. And so today I'm going to hopefully give you a bit of an overview into the ocean surface ecosystem, and then also some of the work we're doing as community scientists and the motivation for doing this work as community scientists, why it really matters now more than ever that we all get together and observe this amazing planet that we live on. So one thing as a marine biologist from Arizona that I like to do is imagine where I might pop out if I bored directly through the center of the Earth, right? It's a way to connect to the broad diversity of our planet in kind of an intellectual sense. And one of the reasons I like doing this is because, as you might imagine, oftentimes you pop out somewhere at sea. So I realize everybody is from all over California, but I'd like you to try to guess where you think you might pop out. If you were to put one of those like Looney Tunes magic holes directly underneath you and you fell straight through the center of the Earth out the other side, where would you emerge? And I don't know, let's see. If I were to have guessed unaided, I would have said near Australia. So take a moment to see if you can guess and then have a little victory dance if you're close. And I'm about to show you. So if you were to bore directly through the surface of the Earth, through the core, it would look like this. So that's a great clue, right? Of course not. That's a terrible clue. But in fact, you would end up somewhere around here. So you would end up out kind of east of Madagascar, south of Madagascar, and east of South Africa. I actually need to move my little zoom window so I can see the dot. But the point that I want to make with this is that you would end up in a region of the world that we call the high seas. The high seas covers roughly 43% of Earth's surface, and it exists beyond any one nation's jurisdiction. It's actually larger than the planet Mars in terms of surface area. So the high seas is really this sort of largely unexplored ecosystem right here on planet Earth that belongs to no one people or nation and is larger than all of the mass or all of the surface area of land. So almost anywhere you go on planet Earth, you'll pop out on the high seas. It's very unusual and surprising when you pop out on land. But what is out there? And that's really sort of the driving question of my research. And part of why I think so much about this is because 30% of Earth's surface is covered in soil and dirt and exposed to air, but it represents the vast majority of what we think about when we think about biodiversity. And I'm guilty of this myself. So if you were to say, Rebecca, picture in your mind something really biodiverse right now, I might picture all the bird species on planet Earth, right? Or I might picture something like a tropical rainforest. So I would be biased towards things that occur on land. I live on land, it sort of makes sense, right? But then of course there's coastal habitat. So in addition to this 30%, you could also think about the 27% of Earth's surface that is near shore, that is impacted by coastal processes. And maybe you thought immediately of things like coral reefs, like the Great Barrier Reef off of Australia. These areas, of course, are also very biodiverse, but we still haven't captured that 70% of Earth and that 43% in particular beyond national jurisdictions. Yes, we have coral reefs, we have mangrove marshes, but what about the rest? What about that area larger than the surface area of Mars? What is really out there in the high seas? And so this is what I kind of want to introduce to you today and tell you a bit of a story, not only of what's out there and how they interact with each other, but also how we as humans may be shaping and changing the ocean surface, and why it's so important to do this research now. So I'd like to introduce you just to this surface layer. And part of why I study the surface layer, as I'll share with you in a little bit, is that it's very poorly studied in the West, relative even to the deep sea. So we know that the deep sea is very poorly studied, and you may have heard some numbers about, the deep sea has been less explored than the surface of the moon. I'm not sure if that's true anymore. I'm pretty sure that quote was from the 70s, but it is still extremely understudied relative to places closer to shore. And the ocean surface is even more understudied compared to the deep sea. So we've got a lot of work to do. So let's start by first meeting organisms that live on the ocean surface, independent of anything else. They live there through their own flotation or behaviors. Now, I'd like to draw your attention first to two organisms in the middle, mostly because we're not going to be talking too much about them because they're so fast. So these are things like flying fish or things like paper nautilus octopus. We rarely see these washing ashore because they don't have to wash ashore. They can just get out of the way and swim back to sea. But all the organisms surrounding these two often wash ashore, and you see many of them on the California coast. So I'd like to introduce you to them today. So first is this group of algae called sargassum. And you may have heard about sargassum because there's a really large collection of floating golden sargassum algae in the North Atlantic Ocean. But there is also sargassum in the Pacific. So the Atlantic gets a lot of credit for having sargassum because they have so much of it, but there is definitely Pacific sargassum too. In the Atlantic, the sargassum forms these large floating mats. I've had reports of people who've seen mats like this in the Pacific, but they're generally not well known. But in the Atlantic, there's this kind of amazing historical, biological, oceanographic confluence of forces that occurred, where the Bermuda Triangle, where a lot of ships unwillingly had to travel, and the collection of this algae and trade in North America all kind of took place at the same time. And so sailors developed this like Pavlovian response to sargassum, where they saw it and it just freaked them out. And so we know that there's been sargassum in this region of the ocean for a really long time because it was recorded in things like ship's logs. And sargassum creates the foundation for a whole ecosystem, as do many, many organisms that float on the ocean surface. Here's an animal that I would say is the sargassum of California. This animal is washing ashore in California every year in large numbers, some years huge numbers, some years only modest. But I think it's one of the weirdest animals on the planet. I would put it in like a top 5 contender. It's the only true animal I know of that you could reasonably call mermaid-like. Half of the body is adapted to live out of the water, and half of the body is adapted to live below the water. And the part that lives out of the water is actually hydrophobic. It wicks water off of it like a tent in the rain. And so it has this really amazing physiology. The underside are these blue whirling tentacles, and the up top side is a sail, which is why we call them by the wind sailors or velella velella. And oftentimes when these wash up, they're like the size of the palm of my hand, but I've seen animals that are larger than my whole hand. So they can get really, really big, and they can drift in very large numbers. And we don't really understand what makes for a velella bloom. But this is an example of a photograph taken 3 miles off the coast of La Push in Washington State. When I saw this, I actually thought that this was like on a beach berm, but no, this is in deep water. All of these velella are packed together. They're completely covering the ocean surface, and they're covering it all the way to the horizon. And this is both unusual and apparently quite common. Very few scientists that I've talked to are aware that phenomena like this exist. But when I talk to sailors and fishers in the region, they all seem to go, oh yeah, I've seen that before. That's not so weird. So I think this is an example of a place where naturalists could really inform our understanding of the biology of these animals. And, one thing I want to know is like, if this is all the life at the surface, what's happening underneath? Because we know ocean surface life collects other life. Here is the sailless relative of the by the wind sailor. This is the blue button, Porpita porpita, and they have this amazing ring of tentacles around their central body that they blink in and out, sort of like this living, blooming flower in fast forward. So every couple minutes, they'll blink their tentacles. We don't totally know why. The hypothesis that I've read is they might be trying to circulate water or bring in food or oxygenate their tissue, but they're really incredible, and you can find these in Southern California. Fortunately for California, you don't get too many of these. There's only one report of a Portuguese man-o-war in California. So unlike Florida, which is basically covered in them, y'all got the much milder cousin, the by-the-wind sailor. So I call that a huge win. Nevertheless, these are incredible, beautiful animals. And we do find them in more tropical waters, and they can come up into California. And I think as currents shift and change, we may end up seeing more of them. I'm not sure. But they have these incredible tentacles. And one of the things about Portuguese man-o-war that I think is worth giving them credit for is that they're true animal sailors. The sail on the top can bend and flex, so they can actually change the angle and speed of their body relative to the wind. These big, thick tentacles in the middle, they can actually deploy as sea anchors or drogues to slow them down when they're going too fast. So these animals have a lot of the sailing knowledge that we might consider to be quite sophisticated, even though they don't have a brain. The three animals that I just talked about form the foundation of the ocean surface food web ecosystem. And then there are other animals that eat those animals, and this is one of them. So this is a blue sea dragon. These do occasionally wash up in Southern California, and these animals are incredible nudibranchs, so sea slugs that essentially have turned the world upside down. So they lay on the surface like this and essentially crawl on the surface of the sky, hanging with their back to the abyss. And they have these gummy serrata that they use like fingers to grab onto prey. So here's an example of one of these blue sea dragons eating a Velella. So I put them together because I'm an evil scientist and I like watching things eat other things for science, right? To see what their predatory habits were. And these things just adore Velella, and they eat them by the dozens. They'll just run through one after another, very, very happy. And here you can see one. We're about to go underneath and kind of look underneath as if we were a fish looking from above. And you can see that even though they're blue on their ventral surface, they're actually totally white on their dorsal surface. And that is to blend in with the sky. So they have counter shading to blend in with the ocean from above and to blend in with the sky from below. And if you look closely near the back, you can actually see the heartbeat. So really neat animals. And I mean, it's just like stuffing its face right now. They're very enthusiastic eaters. They also eat Portuguese man-o-war, so you have to be careful. If you encounter one of these, I don't recommend touching it because not only do they eat Portuguese man-o-war, but they eat the tentacle and leave the stinging capsules undigested. And then their digestive system includes these complex branches into those gummy serrata, and those unfired stinging cells will be moved into those serrata and will line their skin along the sides of their body. And so you can actually be stung by a Portuguese man-o-war that was killed and eaten by a blue sea dragon days to weeks after it died. So you want to be really careful touching these guys. Really remarkable critters, but they can sting. Another ocean surface predator that eats life at the ocean surface is something called the violet snail. And these snails have the most distressing life of any animal that I've really thought about. So you can see here, it extends its foot and it's going to wrap it into a cup, going to get that little bubble, kind of smoosh around the cup to coat that bubble in snail slime, and then it's going to attach it to its little raft. Now, these snails can't swim, and their bubble rafts are slowly and constantly popping from the back as that snail slime degrades. And so they have to constantly continue to build up their raft so they don't just sink into the abyss and die. But they do eat things like, by the wind sailor. And when they bump into an animal, they often have to crawl off their raft in order to eat it, except if they eat too much and they pop the animal, then they will sink into the abyss and die. And they also have to meet other snails in order to mate. So unlike a lot of animals that live in the open ocean that just kind of like throw their eggs and sperm into the water, these actually have to bump into one another, except they're also cannibals. So there's really no safe place to be a violet snail. You just build your little bubble raft and hope you don't fall into the abyss. And somehow they seem to do great. So here they are getting together. You can see they will exchange these little wriggling packets of sperm. So each one of these little white things that looks like a cartoon sperm is actually like thousands and thousands of sperm all packed together, and they'll sort of swap as they meet. So this was a romantic meeting, I guess. No one's eating anyone here. Here's a violet snail taking the opportunity to eat a by the wind sailor that I am very maliciously pushing towards it. So this was part of a study to determine the diets of different animals at the ocean surface so we could begin to construct a food web. So here I am, booping a little by the wind sailor, and the snail's getting ready. And there it lunges out, almost like a turkey, grabs a huge hunk of the by the wind sailor and will sort of rip it off. You can see the by the wind sailor tries to deter the predator by dropping tentacles on purpose, kind of like a lizard drops its tail, autonomizing those tentacles in the hopes that the snail grabbed one of those tentacles it's just going to like sacrifice and let go of. And that means that the snail will no longer be holding on to the actual animal, which is what actually happened here. The snail got some tentacles, its mouth is full, it has no hands, so the tentacles fell off. The snail cannot continue to feed on the animal. I'm checking because it's so cool. And one of the fascinating things about what happened next is that after the snail took a big hunk out of this by the wind sailor, I tried to repeat this study because I wanted to watch a snail in a sort of more thorough feeding encounter, and I couldn't. The by the wind sailor had popped some sort of force field that meant I couldn't actually push the two together anymore. I could pull the by the wind sailor away and it would drift away no problem. But when it got within about 1.5 inches of that snail, that force field pushed the snail away from the by the wind sailor and it wasn't able to feed anymore. It's totally bizarre. I have no idea what it was. Very unusual biology. So when you float out on the high seas and you really have no defenses, I suppose there are a lot of secret defenses that we're still learning a lot about, including weird, mysterious, invisible force fields. So from this paper, I was able to construct this rough food web using both observations that I made and then also observations from many other amazing scientists in the literature. And what became very clear very quickly is that a lot of animals really depend on the ocean surface habitat. Now, I've mostly been thinking and talking about free-floating animals, but there are lots of things that live at the ocean surface, and some rather infamous animals that are known for eating plastic are featured in this slide. So many turtles that are known to eat plastic actually preferentially prey on ocean surface life, and that's also true with things like albatross. So suddenly the pieces are starting to click together. Why are all these animals eating plastic? Well, they're trying to eat surface life instead. Now I want to tell you about a really weird group of animals that I think gets quite a bad rap, and that is the rafting organisms, or as I've heard them called, the trash animals. And so these are animals that seem to be found mostly on plastic. Now, I put this beautiful picture of beechwood and driftwood in the background because a really amazing study came out last year that modeled using mathematics and current river flow how much really large wood debris, things larger than a meter, would make it into the ocean with no dams and no deforestation and no logging. We know in Europe, people have been logging along rivers for about 500 years, even longer in some cases. You can go all the way back to the Romans, and they've dammed many major rivers for the past 200 years, 250 years. And so even when people like Darwin were out on the ocean surface, it was quite different from what it may have been before. And so this paper looked at what might have existed on the ocean surface prior to all of that damming and all of that logging. And they found that at the most extreme, only about 0.5% of the wood that used to be in the ocean exists in the ocean today. So 99.5% of this habitat has left the ocean. And by the time even the earliest naturalists went out to the ocean, most of that was already gone. And so that helps explain why you have these really remarkable and strange animals that are only adapted to live on floating stuff that now live mostly on plastic. So I want to introduce them to you. So here's an example to start out with that's maybe not so controversial. So this is a trash animal in the sense that you can find it on trash. But this is a sargassum frogfish, so it can also be found floating in seaweed. So this is one of 10 species that's only found on floating algae out to sea. Now, in California, there used to be a lot more floating kelp that would make it far offshore, and there were rafters that were only found on that floating kelp. So algae is an excellent way to transport animals that both live specifically on algae and specifically in the open ocean. Here's another animal that's often found on plastic. So this particular pelagic shrimp likes to live on floating debris right at the ocean surface. You can see it also walks over this thing that looks like a little tree that kind of pops up like that little cartoon tree. That's a special species of jellyfish larva that lives only on floating debris. And they pop off these little microscopic jellyfish that then have baby jellyfish that move on to other pieces of floating debris. Then there are things like nudibranchs. This particular nudibranch kind of looks like some kind of organic piece of material, in this case, sargassum. There are also pelagic nudibranchs. My favorite is called Fiona, which I also just love animals that have people names. Like that's the Latin name, and I think it's great. And these pelagic nudibranchs live on very small objects, and I haven't seen a lot of studies on them, but just based on my personal observation, it's really remarkable to watch their sort of social reasoning with each other. Like they're very peaceful in spite of living on a very tiny bottle cap, for example. One of the things that you're most likely to find on plastic is pelagic barnacles, like these barnacles right here. These little lepus barnacles are maybe the size of a sesame seed, but they can get really, 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 really big, and they can live for a pretty long time. Lepus barnacles are one of the only animals that's known to socially share food with non-relatives. So once one barnacle settles on a piece of debris, other non-relatives will settle around it. And if one barnacle catches a piece of food that's too big, it will lean over and share it with neighbors. So they have this really amazing kind of social barnacle structure that you don't see in barnacles that aren't sort of stuck on these tiny little pieces of debris floating out to sea. I don't know, there's some metaphor in here that I'm sure an artist or poet could extract about life on planet Earth. But anyway, and then one of my favorites is this little rafting crab. This crab is called Planes. It is my favorite for 3 reasons. One, it's very, very sassy. It's one of the sassiest crabs I've ever met. It will beat you up. Like it will attack you from inside its little bucket in a jar. So they just have no fear. They're tiny terriers of the crab world. The second reason I love it is that they actually change color like squid and octopus. So they have chromatophores under their shells that allow them to match the color of their substrate. When they're living on something purple, they'll slowly turn purple. When they're living on something green, they'll slowly turn green. It takes a couple days. You know, they're like very slow squid, but they can do it, which is really magical. And the third reason is that in addition to living on floating debris, you can sometimes find them hiding tucked under the tail of sea turtles. So they're like these little turtle butt crabs, and they walk around the turtle shell and clean the shell and help the little turtle. So it's like a little mascot hiding under the crab tail. So that's life on the ocean surface in a nutshell. And what I'd like to transition to now, although maybe a bit depressing, I think is more of an opportunity to really think about why it's so urgent to study life on the ocean surface. In addition to life on the ocean surface, there's also a lot of human activity on the ocean surface. So when you think of almost every major human impact on the ocean, it either starts at or has to pass through the surface. So the ocean surface is the front line for almost every major ecological challenge. And the health of the ocean surface influences the health of lower levels of the ocean. When you have an oil slick, it doesn't just impact the surface, it impacts life underneath. So we know that humans are impacting the ocean surface through things like oil. We also know humans are impacting the ocean surface through our transit. Really interesting paper came out recently talking about the impact of artificial lights on animals really far out to sea. As ships cross the ocean in the dark of night, animals that have never been exposed to artificial light are suddenly exposed to the ship. And so the ship can have this wave of impact as it's traveling over the ocean surface, and we don't really understand the implications of those impacts. There are also things like garbage and plastic in particular floating on the ocean surface that tend to collect in regions offshore. Now, this particular figure shows the hypothesized regions of high concentrations of plastic on the ocean surface, but it's important to point out that especially for places like California, you actually get a lot of plastic coming from Japan in particular. After the 2011 Japanese tsunami, there were whole groups of community scientists that were looking for Japanese debris, and there was Japanese debris washing up throughout the state. So high seas plastic, yes, goes to these garbage patch regions, but it doesn't have to exclusively. And this, of course, then has impacts on animals near and far from shore. So trying to untangle these impacts is really important. Now, I don't really like this grizzly bird picture, so I'm going to leave it for a minute. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why this story is really complicated. Because, for example, rafters likely lived on wood, which is really depleted on the ocean surface, the impact of plastic is, at least to some degree, a little bit mixed. So there are some animals that we know have actually increased in abundance due to plastic, and others that are being really harmed by it. So detangling the harm and detangling the potential advantages of any kind of floating substrate can help us think about how to move into a space conservation-wise where we can still protect floating life at the surface while also reducing the impact of harmful waste, which is really important. Then there is also fishing. And I put this up because I really wasn't aware of how much fishing impacts the ocean surface. But as one example, the South Pacific tuna fishery releases, I think the estimate that I heard most recently was something around 50,000 artificial floating objects into the ocean every year. And these are big objects. We're talking whole trees, big derelict nets, often made of plastic. They'll have a satellite tracker and a motion detector on them. These are called fish aggregating devices because not only is floating debris important for things like sassy little crabs, but it's also really important for big animals like tuna and small animals like schooling fish, which collect and hide around and associate with floating debris. The motion detector on these trackers will let the fishers know when there's enough tuna. They'll go out with a net like this called a purse seine net. They'll wrap it all the way around the floating object. Then they'll cinch it on the bottom like a purse. So it essentially becomes a bag, and then they'll pull everything in. Many of these objects are lost at sea or abandoned at sea. And so we have the intentional sort of entry of lots of floating debris into the ocean every year through fishing. And all of these impact the surface. So why don't we study the surface? I said that no one's really studying the surface, like what's actually going on there? Well, they did. In the Soviet Union, it was super popular to study the ocean surface, and people actually traveled for years across the ocean surface collecting data. But unfortunately, this was during the height of the Cold War. And so a lot of this information is now buried in archives or behind paywalls or in libraries collecting dust and falling apart. And that's why we're all here today. So we need current maps. Let me tell you about one citizen science project if I have time. I think I've got time. And then I'll go ahead and tell you a little bit about our broader project that we would love for you to join us on. So this is in collaboration with my colleague, Nikolai Maximenko, and he's a physical oceanographer. He runs essentially a tiny simulation of the ocean on his computer. It's actually not tiny. It's actually a really impressively large simulation, but relative to the ocean, very tiny, on his computer, which allows us to do a couple cool things. It allows us to recreate where things might be based on past current data. And it also allows us to rewind currents to see where stuff may have come from. So when a mystery object washes ashore, we can rewind the surface currents from the date it arrived and see if we can predict its past trajectory, how it eventually got to the shore. So we ran this for Houston that don't have any kind of sail, and we predicted their distribution is in the center of the North Pacific subtropical gyre with their highest density in red, like right in the middle. And this is such a huge bummer because this is the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, and we really didn't want them to be stuck with a bunch of trash. So we're like, okay, you know, maybe it's fine. Maybe it's fine. This is just a simulation. Let's actually get out there and see what's going on. Easier said than done. Really hard to get ships out there. Not a popular destination. But Nikolai happened to know someone named Ben Lecomte. And Ben is one of the wildest people I've ever met. He is the chillest, calmest guy, and he just happens to swim across whole oceans like for fun. And so Ben had decided to raise awareness about the issue of plastics pollution. He was going to swim from Hawaii to California. And to do this, you know, so he's like breaststroking, and he has a sailboat in front of him that essentially has a long line coming off the back that he uses as a fixed point to follow, because otherwise it's really hard to get your bearings when you're really far out to sea. And so that sailboat kind of guides Ben and makes sure he's not lost or like eaten by a shark or something. And then Ben just swims for like 8, 10, 12 hours a day, takes a short rest, does it again. So this is Ben's projected path through the garbage patch. It actually got a little more complicated because the garbage patch is constantly moving as the currents churn it around. So this is where the garbage patch actually ended up. And you'll notice that Ben even did a little loop for us. He looped back like the width of Arizona to go through some of these highest density regions so that we could get lots of data before, in, and after the garbage patch. So we have now these 3 really great regions with the blue boxes representing outside and the red boxes representing inside. And here's one example of the kind of sample that we found in the garbage patch. Now, all those beautiful cerulean blue things are animals. You can see all the little rings are by the wind sailor babies. There are a bunch of violet snails in there. There's some blue sea dragons. And then there's also a lot of plastic. Now, what's really funny is that lots of people have done lots of studies on the distribution of plastic in the garbage patch, and they've just tossed all the animals. So by taking photographs and using community scientists on the boat, we were actually able to quantify the number of animals in addition to the amount of plastic. And here's what we found. So on the y-axis, we have Houston, and on the x-axis, we have plastic, and all the little dots represent individual samples, and that line represents sort of an average between all of the samples. And what you can see is there's a really tight relationship between the amount of Houston and the amount of plastic. And for those of you that love statistics, you'll be like, that one little point at the top, oh, don't worry, we spent so much time worrying about that one little point to make sure it wasn't skewing our data. And even if you remove those influential points, we still found that when there's more Houston, there's also more plastic. So there seems to be, at least in our study, in Ben's swim, a positive relationship between plastic and Houston. So Houston seemed to co-occur with plastic on the high seas, but like we're a little bit at a shortage for people that are willing to swim across ocean basins for us. Like that's not something most folks are willing to volunteer to do, but we have that secret weapon up our sleeve. In addition to using the surface current model to predict where animals might be in the future, we can also use those same surface current models to rewind where they are and see where they may have come from in the past. And this is where shorelines become our absolute best friend, because shorelines are these great barriers where Houston accidentally wash up all the time, and we can use those in conjunction with our model to figure out where hotspots of Houston might be offshore. So we've got these garbage patches, But what about everything else? And this is where we work with our community members to run a Go See campaign. So here's our iNaturalist page. We have currently lots of observers. We've been running for about 1.5 years. So we're officially in phase 2. We just implemented some changes based on interviews we had with some of our community members. And we are collecting information on all life that floats on the surface, both Newston life and rafting life. And not only are we collecting information on life, but we actually want you to report anything that you see at the ocean. And I'll explain why. So first, let me walk through a little bit of what you might expect in California. So if you are looking for something like Valella, you are in luck. Like, this is one of the top places in the whole world to see this animal. And I really don't want to understate this. This is such a cool thing. I'm from like an hour south of the Grand Canyon. I get that it can be really tempting to just write off all the most awesome aspects of your state because they're so familiar to you. But this is really, really neat. The fact that California gets so many Valella is special and unusual and definitely worthy of study. You also do get Purpita in the south. And also, if you decide to go down to Rocky Point, you will see some potential Purpita there as well. The one man-o-war. So my goodness, if you see man-o-war, I feel like it'll make it in like the LA Times if someone sees one at this point, because they're so unusual, but it's still fun to see. And then, of course, in addition to some of those Newstonic organisms, you also have rafting organisms. So I didn't mention all the Newston. There's some violet snails and other things that wash ashore in California, but I also want to talk about things like lepus, because if you see floating debris, it's very likely that you'll see something like this animal attached to it. But we'll also take weird algae and strange bacterial films and shipworms and anything that's living on plastic. We want to know about it. So now that we've shown you a little bit of what we're looking for, but basically the rule will be anything that floats, I want to tell you a little bit about like how to find them if you're a novice. So if it's blue, add it to the list. Very few things in the ocean are blue. Most of the things in the ocean that are blue float. So if it's blue, just right away, you know it's important and worth adding to our project. If it's something that looks like it could float, so I have over here a little chamber of a shell. These shells will often float at the surface, even though the animals that they were once inside are kind of deep sea. We want that too. If it's an algae that's floating, you'll often notice these little gas-filled pockets. We want that. This beautiful shell in the middle is a paper nautilus shell. It's really light. Most things that float on the ocean surface that are made of natural animal or algal products tend to be a lot lighter than you would expect them to be just from looking at it. So that's a good indicator as well. And of course, anytime you find debris, check it to see what's living on it. This is also, I think, a good thing to do. One of my friends has rescued many, many fish that are living inside bottles and crab traps and octopus traps and things like that. So it's always good to just do a little turn of large plastic debris items that you find, both for life and in case you need to do a little search and rescue. If you happen to find any dead animals, of course, if you're squeamish or if it might be like dangerous, don't approach, right? I would never approach like a dead whale, for example, because I've seen one explode in a video once and it was too much. So I'll never get close. But here we have some lepus on a penguin wing. So this penguin has been floating for some period of time, and these barnacles have actually grown on it. You can actually use barnacles in forensic studies to estimate when things died. So it's really cool to be able to see things like lepus growing on things that have been floating out at sea. And now here's the weird request. Anytime you go to the beach, we would love for you to upload your images. And we've made it really easy for you to do it so that you don't swamp our project, but also we really, really need these data. And the only real way to say it is to say that nothing matters, right? So if you didn't see anything, there'll be a little drop-down menu and we'll ask, did you see any floating life today? And all you have to say if you didn't see any floating life is no. And then proceed to upload with abandon, right? That is great. All that information is propagated to the pictures, so we know we can count all of those data in our observations. So truly, 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 nothing matters. It's amazing that absence of evidence does not equal evidence of absence. We really need to know where these animals are, and we also need to know where they're not. And so if you have a favorite beach where no plastic ever washes the shore, it's a really pristine, beautiful beach, please send us data from there. If we get consistent data that no floating life is washing ashore, that will really help us inform our oceanographic models and rewind those currents. So now I want to turn it over to Ari, who has prepared a list of different organisms that you might find at the ocean surface, and you can test your knowledge. Now, I want to say I actually took this quiz earlier today, and some of them really tripped me up, and there's no shame in that. So Ari, do you want to take it from here and introduce our challenge for today?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, great. So I'm going to stop sharing, and then we'll pop it over to you.
So how this is going to work, Ari is going to share his screen, and he's going to have a series of images that come up on the screen, and I'm going to launch a poll in Zoom. And what we want you to do is, for the image he shows you, we want you to answer the corresponding question in Zoom. But all of the questions are going to come up at once. So when he shows you image number 1, you're going to answer number 1. Image number 2, you're going to answer number 2. But don't hit submit until you're finished. You got to go answer all the questions, and then you can hit submit. So I'm going to launch the poll now, and you're probably going to have to move the poll off to the side of your screen, so you can grab the top of it and just slide it to the side of your screen so you can see the pictures that Ari is sharing. And I'll make sure to say the number of the image to the corresponding question so you can follow along that way. So go ahead.
Can you see the poll on my screen? Like, is it covering the presentation?
No, I can see it. I can see your screen fine.
Okay, cool. Sweet. All right, so here is the first one.
So image number 1.
Yeah. Basically, would this be something that you would upload to the project if you saw it?
I'm sorry, I may be like Zoom incompetent. How do we click on the yes or no?
You don't click on the screen, you click on the poll that pops up.
Aha, okay. I'm still struck. Okay, that's fine. So if I clicked on number 1, yes, that's what you're looking for. Okay.
Yeah, actually, I don't know that any of the answers are coming in.
Sarah May, you're muted.
The answers won't come in.
I realize that. So the poll's not working correctly, so just type it into the chat. So if you think it's surface life, type yes into the chat. If you don't think it's surface life, type no into the chat.
I thought we weren't supposed to hit submit until after all 16 questions or something.
Yeah, I think that's what's going on. So I think that all of the answers that you guys put in won't come in until after we end the poll.
Yeah, so just type it into the chat. Apologies for the confusion. So seeing mostly yeses so far.
If I
Yes.
can add, if you vote in the poll and then close the poll, you can see the screen again, go back to chat and reopen the poll each time. You can still vote that way.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. All right, so seeing mostly yeses in the chat.
And yeah, it definitely is. So this is sargassum. And if you ever find seaweed that washes ashore and you're not sure if it's sargassum, that's something that you would put in that drop-down menu is like, I don't know. And then the people who identify things on iNaturalist would help you out there, including me.
Yep, so just put your answers in the chat box. So next one, this is number 2.
Yep, same concept here. So I'm seeing mostly yeses. And yeah, this is an example of rafters on plastic. So this is super valuable too, because not only is it showing that there's surface life, but also that there's plastic washing ashore.
Yes, and it is really helpful to take a picture that includes some of the plastic or some of the wood so that we know. Okay, thanks, Ari, for throwing us a couple bones too.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, they're going to get harder from here.
All right, question 3. Which of the 3 do you think this is? Plastic, Newston, or both? And remember, Newston is the label for surface life.
Sorry.
Okay, I'm seeing both is the prominent one. 1 Newston, 2 Newston, 3 Newston, more Newstons coming in.
Yeah, good job, guys. So it's actually all Portuguese metalworks. There's no plastic in this photo. But you can tell that it's really hard to tell them apart. Like they truly do look like plastic.
Move your situation here.
What?
All right, next one.
No, those green flakes are actually leaves. All right, so do these occur in California?
Ooh, tricky. They didn't get this one.
I like the no idea. All right, we've got a good mix, understandably so. So these actually do occur in California. I think this is actually the only species of violet snail that occurs in California. So it's the elongated violet snail, Yanthina umbilicata. And as far as the data that I found on iNaturalist, this is the only one that's ever been reported on iNaturalist to be found in California, and pretty much only in the southern part too. So these are pretty rare, but they do indeed occur in California.
And if you are a shell collector, these are gold. So
Oh, they're beautiful.
yeah, so rare.
So we did have a couple of questions that come in, so let's do a couple more slides and then we'll take a minute to answer those questions.
Okay, sure.
Okay, so how many different animal species are in this photo?
We got it. 3, 4, 5, more than 5. Seen some more 3s. Yeah, it actually it is 3. So we see some by the wind sailors there. So we see some violet snails and Portuguese man-o-war. Let's skip this one. All right, what's the common name for these barnacles? And these are the leafless barnacles, by the way. Nice, you guys got it. Yeah, these are gooseneck barnacles. They are called that because back before they really knew how things reproduced, they thought that these turned into geese. So funny little backstory there. Let's skip this one. This is both, by the way. Kind of just shows how hard it is to tell plastic and Newston apart once again. This is why our sea turtles are eating plastic. All right. What is this animal? Yep, all right, I'm seeing it in there. These are like baby by the wind sailors. So sometimes they look a little different. These haven't like developed their growth rings yet, which is a good way to identify these if you ever see them wash ashore. So when they're tiny, they kind of take a little bit of time to get their growth rings in. Sometimes their sails too. Sometimes you can barely even see their sails.
And Ari, would you mind popping back to the last one?
Oh, sure. Maybe. There we go.
So I love this
Yeah.
picture because this is where I made a mistake. So do y'all know? You probably know, you're Californians. Yeah, so my confused Arizonan self thought these were plastic. And this is actually the first time I ever found a Neostonic animal. I was picking up plastic on the beach and was like, what are all these weird pieces of plastic? So that was really another like very educational moment for me. Why so many things are eating plastic, because if I can't tell them apart.
And Rebecca, I'll ask one of our questions. Heather Sabin asked, I would be inclined to pick up plastic garbage, but what do we do if there are things living on it?
That is, I think, something that, so I've talked to several different people about this. I've talked to some folks in Hawaii who are doing cleanups more from the perspective of a traditional Hawaiian ecological understanding of the world. And their general sense was that they would sort of do a full eval of the object. And if it didn't pose an entanglement risk to marine life and it harbored a lot of life on it, they would actually sometimes leave it in the ocean. That's, I would say, very different from the sort of traditional ecological view that we have in sort of a mainland American culture, where you would say, throw it all away. I'll kind of maybe, instead of answering it, share for myself that from the literature I've read, the things that are most dangerous to animals are films, bags, anything that might look like a jellyfish that can clog a digestive tract, and anything that can entangle an animal. So ropes, twine, fishing line, things like that. Statistically, entanglements of the reports that I've read, roughly 72% of them end in mortality versus ingestion of plastic, which for small hard pieces of plastic, not bags, but small hard pieces of plastic, is a much lower incident of mortality. So yeah, for myself, I struggle with this every time. And I do really respect the sort of traditional Hawaiian approach of taking a really holistic view of that. It is still really hard for me to leave plastic in the environment, though. So it's something that I struggle with a lot, and I wish I had a better answer, but I guess that's some of the insight that's been given to me that I can at least pass along.
No, I think that's a great answer, Rebecca. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
I'm going to just really quickly, since we have only about 3 minutes left, Elliot, if you wouldn't mind putting the link to the Go See iNaturalist project in the chat. One of the things to remember when you look for Go See on iNet, it's GO-SEA. And so you do need the hyphen in there to find the project. And another question is, how do you submit negative data on iNaturalist?
So we have a drop-down menu when you submit to our project that will ask if you've seen floating life that day. So if you click no, then you can submit anything else that you saw that day to our project. So as long as you've documented one cool organism, that's enough. So we generally say, go to the beach with the intention of finding cool things, not with the goal of finding floating life, because you can't always control where these things wash ashore, and share everything you find with us. Also, can I just say from the back end, we have a lot of fun living vicariously through y'all. So it's really great for us to see where you go and the cool things you find.
And then our last question, and I don't know if this is something you can answer, Rebecca, but it's an interesting one, and I'll get back to the asker if this is not off the top of your head. David Walker asks, how deep does temperature stratification go in the open ocean? Seems like the surface depends on warmer water.
It really depends on where you are in the open ocean. So like in, sort of coastal California, I mean, you don't really have much stratification sometimes because you have so much upwelling from deeper water. Once you get far out to sea, it can be really stratified. And actually, there's even a thin layer right at the air-sea interface that can get really hot. That being said, things like Velella can survive in really cold temperatures, like 10 degrees Celsius-ish. So it depends a little bit on the animal. Lepus do really well when it's cold. Velella do really well when it's cold. We don't see a ton of Physalia when it's cold, or blue buttons when it's cold. So we've definitely sort of through other data learned that temperature is important, but it's different for each species.
Cool. All right. Well, Ari, do you want to tell them the answer to this final question, because we do have to sign off in a second?
Sure, yeah, these are the same species. The one on the left is a like rare yellow variant of a blue button jelly, but for the most part, they are blue.
Thank you so much. All right, everyone. Well, I just want to say a massive thank you to Rebecca and Ari. I've had the privilege of meeting with them a few times over the last couple months, learning more about their project. I'm out on the beach 3 to 5 days a week. I upload a ton of stuff to the Go See project, and I really encourage those of you who are coastal dwellers to do the same, or if you're visiting the coast, to do the same as well. Your ability to contribute to science through these sorts of projects really makes the science possible, and I hope Rebecca and Ari have really impressed that on you today. Ari also runs the Go See project social media on Facebook and Instagram, and he does a great job. IG is the really place to go for all of that material. But yeah, you can ask us more. We'll share this video, and we will also share Ari and Dr. Helm's contact information if you'd like to contact them more about what they do. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending our cones today. We are going to likely have another cones next month in February, and we'll be getting that information out to you as soon as possible. Until then, go forth and science, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us.